Brilliant. Thank you very much. I was just at the coffee break and I was asked someone, what's the purpose of longevity science? And they said it's to make people's dreams come true. And I'm slightly wary of dreams because I was at the West Coast a couple of weeks ago at a massive conference of senior business leaders. And there was this guru who was speaking to this very large audience of very important people, almost as important as the people here today. And I said, this was his wife. And I said to his wife, I said, I bet in your wildest dreams you didn't imagine that your husband would be speaking to all these incredibly important people. And she turned to me and she said, Octavius, in my wildest dreams, my husband does not feature. So I'm going to steer well clear of dreams today. But as Lynn was kind enough to say, I launched MindGym 20-odd years ago in my kitchen with the idea of using psychology and behavioural science to improve the world we live in by helping us make better decisions and choices. And in particular, we focused on the world of work. And I remember early on trying to persuade people about this and going to see a potential client and saying, I can use psychology to improve your business. And he said, Octavius, I don't think you quite get my view on psychology in organisations. And I said, well, probably not. He said, I think psychology in organisations is a bit like bidets in bathrooms. They might add a touch of class, but no one knows quite what to do with them. So I hope the world has moved on since then, and we can bring some science and rigour. In those 23 years, we have had 5 million people now come to a MindGym event of some sort or another. We work with most of the FTSE 100, most of the S&P 100, and I'm delighted as part of Longevity Week to be launching our research paper, copies available outside, also online, on well working, how we can all be better at work. So the question I'm really interested in coming to in just a moment is, to what extent does business make us healthier, or does it have the opposite effect? But before I do, I want to briefly touch on the effect of health on business, the other way around. And you'll have heard from many speakers today about the ageing population. Dr. Clegg talked about it very articulately, and the impact that is going to have on the business world. Even in the short term, we're seeing that 750,000 people have a working age, have left the workforce since the beginning of COVID. We have long-term sickness affecting 2.6 million people of working age, and short-term sickness is the highest level it's been for 75 years. As we have an ageing population, we also have a younger population that's sicker, and our chances of being able to support us economically are massively reduced. You don't need to be an economist to know that the two main reasons why economies grow are either people becoming more productive or more people at work. We have historically been not great at improving the productivity per person. It may be that AI is about to change that. But we did see a big surge in economic growth in the 80s and 90s, and that was predominantly because a lot more women came into the workplace, and so the working population increased significantly. Obviously, our best chance of that happening again is for older people to enter the workplace, but of course, if they're sick or we are sick and ill, that is much less likely to happen. So health is really important for work, but it's also important the other way around. And business leaders have not missed these stats that I've shared, and are watching the absenteeism, the long-term sickness going on, and are very keen to see what business can do to increase well-being. Long gone are the days, I know the famous line of Steve Jobs, where he said, if you don't come in on Saturday, don't bother turning up on Sunday. There was a kind of workaholism that was prevalent at that time, that if you did that now, I think you'd almost certainly lose your job as the CEO in most public organisations. More CEOs got fired for behavioural transgressions than for financial underperformance in 2019. So you're seeing a massive shift there. So business leaders are clearly very aware of this, and they're not just talking about it, but they're spending about it as well. And I think one of the interesting dynamics is the growth in spending on well-being initiatives, corporate well-being activity. And I think the first question we have to ask ourselves is this working well, or is it hardly working at all? And I'm going to share one study conducted over 18 months, but there are other studies like it over 2 years and similar sizes of population. And in this study, they looked at 3,000 workers, all done in the same company, and they took part in about 30 different wellness or well-being activities. Now, those could be anything from nutritional advice to a clinical assessment. They could be being given fresh fruit, gym membership, meditation apps, yoga, Pilates, the whole range of activity over the period of 18 months. And then they used 80 measures at pre and post level to compare the 3,000 who'd taken part versus the 22,000 of the control group who had not, all from the same company in apparently similar situations. And what they discovered was this, that in 78 out of 80 measures, there was no difference at all. Interesting enough, of the two measures that there was a difference, one was taking slightly more exercise, and the other was intent to manage weight. If you look on the right-hand side, 4 down, you'll see the body mass index was unchanged. So that intent to manage weight didn't actually translate into any physical change at all. So and another study looked at this, measured healthcare spending, and discovered that healthcare spending was exactly the same statistically. In fact, it was fractionally more for those who had taken part in the wellbeing initiatives versus those who had not. So I think what we're seeing here is that £50 billion is being spent corporately. It may be great virtue signalling, it may be a very nice employee benefit, but it's not changing the well-being of people at work. So that's the first interesting thing. The second question is, I think, why is this the case? First of all, we discover that there's a very high drop-off rate. The most popular wellbeing initiatives get about 39% take-up when they are launched. But that drops in 9 months to 8% who are still participating in it. So there's a massive drop-off rate. Secondly, the people who take part in them are the ones who need them least and are almost certainly doing the same thing but not on the company's dime somewhere else. So very, very few people go, I've never thought of lifting a weight, but now I've got company gym membership, I'm going to go pumping iron every day. It just doesn't happen. What we find is that people who work more than 50 hours a week are a tenth as likely to take part in wellbeing initiatives as those who work less than 50 hours a week. So you're directing your investment at the people who need it least. You're directing it at people who are currently doing something like this already. But you're also, as a company, directing your investment in the wrong place. And this, I think, is perhaps the more interesting aspect here. So if we broadly, and I'm going to paraphrase terribly, and I'll ask the academics in the room, almost all the room in that case, to forgive me for this, but 3 simple ways of determining what affects our sense of mental and to some extent physical well-being. The first thing is personal factors. This is where you were born, your genetics, your upbringing. Many people have come across adverse childhood experiences. Did your parents suffer from addiction or with a terrible divorce, or did you lose a parent in early childhood? All of these things greatly affect our chances of suffering from depression and all sorts of other conditions in later life. The second area that greatly affects this, and many of you have talked about this today and study it in much more depth than I have, are all the sorts of factors that go on in the rest of our life. How much do we sleep? What do we eat? What level of exercise do we take? Are we in a loving relationship? Do we have a pet? Did our soccer team win or lose at the weekend? There are a zillion things that affect us in life outside of work. But then there is the third area, and that is what it is like actually at work. Is our boss an insight, an inspiration, or an idiot? Do our colleagues undermine us, or do they help us and look after us? And this has an enormous impact as well. But what corporate well-being programs do is they tend to focus on trying to affect the bottom right circle. And though that circle is very important, the employer has virtually no impact in it. Our political views are very important as well, but our employer's political stance doesn't tend to affect our own. And our employer saying to eat fewer brownies or stand up and walk around doesn't tend to go down terribly well. However, where companies can focus and should focus is in this green area, what it is like at work. So if we find out, first of all, where to focus, the second question is, what do we do about it? And here we have a team of about 70 psychologists at MindGym, a lovely academic board of magnificent psychology professors who've been advising us over the last while. We looked at over 200 studies, peer-reviewed studies, to find out what are the main drivers that we can affect at work in practical ways that will determine levels of well-being. And I'm briefly going to share those. There's the 5. The first one, which has massive correlates with a whole range of different health outcomes, is the level of certainty. Small levels of uncertainty lead to acute stress, which can have increased levels of cortisol, increased blood pressure, and a whole range of other short-term factors. Being in an uncertain environment where things are constantly changing, your boss is changing their mind, your goals are being upset, you're constantly restructuring, leads to chronic stress. And that, as many of you will know much better than me, has a strong correlation, the causal effect on a whole range of areas, for example, heart disease and cancer and other illnesses. So the effect of regular uncertainty is very significant on our sense of well-being. Now, what's the other interesting thing about this is that actually uncertainty, according to some research, is worse than some levels of pain. And I'll share an example of an experiment that a team did to illustrate this. They asked the sample size, either you have a 50-50 chance of getting a pain from your finger on an electric shock, or you get a 100% chance of getting a pain from an electric shock. And those who had the 50-50, when the scanning was on, had more of the psychological and physiological impacts of stress, even though there was a 50% chance they wouldn't get the pain, than those who knew they would get the shock. So uncertainty is having a very dramatic effect on our sense of chronic and acute and then chronic stress. There's also lots that we can do very practically at work. Your boss says to you, "I'd like to see you tomorrow morning." And you go, "Crumbs, what have I done?" And you're worried all night and you're not sleep. Your boss says, "I'd like to see you tomorrow 5 minutes. I loved your report, and if you could just give me a few more snippets, that'd be really helpful." 16 words transforms my level of certainty. The email that someone in your team sends you, slightly anxious, slightly nervous, they think they may have overstepped the mark. You leave it to reply for 2 days. That person's got a high level of uncertainty. You say, "Thanks so much for a really interesting point. Let me give it proper thought before I get back to you." Suddenly there's calm and release. We can also find our own levels of certainty. We were working with a big organisation that was restructuring, closing down lots of sites, and people were terribly worried as to whether their site would be closing down. We said, well, which sites are they inserting new fibre optic cable? Well, probably they're going to keep those sites, and the ones they're not are probably the ones they aren't. So we can start to pick up information to increase our levels of certainty. So certainty is the first of the 5 drivers. The second is competence. The feeling that I am able to do something. I am capable of whatever it is I've been set out to achieve. Now, there's that terrible old cliche from Henry Ford that says, if you think you can, you think you can't, you're probably right. This is, of course, complete nonsense. I may think I can leap tall buildings with a single bound, but it says more about my mental state than my physical agility that I even have that thought in the first place. However, self-efficacy is strongly correlated with optimism. And optimism is a really interesting factor that increases, you're more likely to have healthy relationships, you're more likely to persist, you're more likely to achieve more, and actually you're more likely to live longer. Now you might think, wow, how on earth can you conduct an experiment that suggests that optimism leads you to live longer? And so I should tell you about an experiment that did precisely this. It was based in a convent. Now, convents are very interesting because everyone has basically the same social and physical environment, roughly the same diet, sleep at roughly the same time, at the same temperature. Everything about the convent is very controlled. And when you go into a convent, and I imagine no one here has been to this, I certainly haven't, but I'm told this is the case, you write a letter of going into the convent. So at 22 you write your letter about how you're feeling about life and the world and everything else. And then of course you can measure how long the people who live, and you can correlate it with the level of positivity in the initial letter. So the 22 wrote the letter in the beginning of the 20th century, and they measured the level of positivity or optimism in those letters and the longevity of the nuns. And the most positive outlived the rest by 10 years. So there's a massive correlation there, at the very least, probably some level of causation in optimism. Just for those of you who aren't optimists, and Professor Montgomery might possibly be one of them, the good news is that for pessimists is that they are right more often. So optimists are very persistent, but they're usually wrong, whereas pessimists are usually right, which is not going to introduce the rest of us who are optimists, but good to know. So competence is very important, as is certainty. The next one I'm going to talk a bit about is autonomy. Again, I'm going to share an experiment here of people in later life. This is an experiment done in a nursing home, where the residents were all given a plant. And half the residents were told, please can you look after this plant? And the other half were told, don't worry, the plant will be looked after by the resident staff, the nursing home staff. And the ones who were given the plant to look after were also allowed to choose the film on Saturday evening from a choice of 3 or 4. So they had small levels of agency, not massive, go to Netflix and download what you like, and not creating an arboretum. But nonetheless, a plant to look after and a film to choose versus the others. And then what they measured was, first of all, the self-report on health and happiness was significantly greater on those who looked after the plant versus those who didn't. These nursing staff said that they looked much happier, but actually the morbidity over the next 18 months was half the rate of those who had the plant that was given to them. So there's a really strong factor between the sense of autonomy and the sense of control and our chances of living longer in this particular case. It's also something we can create at work quite a lot. Autonomy tends to be quite subjective. So you can actually work out whether you focus on the things you can control and think about that, or worry about the things that you can't control. And that lens or perspective will determine your sense of autonomy. There's lots you can do as leaders also to help people increase that autonomy. So there's lots of autonomy. There's interesting research that shows there's one group of people who work longer hours, get paid less, and are happier with their work-life balance. And you might wonder who they are. They are not academics. You don't pay very much and work incredibly long hours. They're in fact the self-employed. And wherever you run this study in different countries, different times, you get the same results. So that suggests that autonomy is a really strong factor for well-being and happiness, as well as potentially for longevity. The fourth area that the research showed is a really strong indicator is belonging. We have a big problem with loneliness. 45% of the UK population declare at least mild levels of loneliness. It's particularly high with Generation Z, who are entering the workplace now, and it's getting a lot worse. It's a lot worse because of working from home and long-distance learning. We know that the sense of loneliness has an enormous correlate with, I'm going to just refer to my notes, it makes us more vigilant, and so it demands the demands in our life seem more threatening, and therefore we move faster to fight or flight, and our dopamine levels drop. So this is really not a great place to be. A chronic loneliness actually is correlated with strokes, heart disease, and dementia. 4% of the population feel chronically lonely at the moment. One of the ways that we can most help this is by bringing people back into offices. The offices are a chance to make casual collisions. You bump into people. You have conversations you never otherwise have in simulations. Events like this are incredibly good for our health, not only because we're learning lots, Jim, which is very valuable, but because we're connecting with people that we often wouldn't connect with. It's those distant connections that are most valuable. And so when we look at the quality of relationships, we find that the diversity of them is a strong correlate with our sense of belonging and our sense of well-being and our health. What happens is that we often tend to see the same people, especially if we work from home. We virtual Zoom with the same 8 or 10 people day in, day out. We tend to hang out as our friendship group with people at similar life stages. If you've got young children or children growing up or children at university, it tends to be your friends are of a similar sort of group. And we tend to, those who spend most of our time talking only to their partner, their small group of friends and their small group of colleagues, to declare lower levels of well-being than those who have a wider group. And that wider group really only comes when we get physical proximity and we get a chance to connect with others. And the fifth and final area I'm going to touch on is about purpose and this sense of having a reason to do something. And again, lots of great research here that we can draw from. If you have a purpose, you're more likely to be happier, you're more likely to have more energy, you're more likely to have healthy habits like sleeping well and eating well. And if you don't, if you don't have much purpose, you have an increased risk of heart disease and dementia and other factors. I think what's interesting here is that men who in a high-pressured environment, the men in a high-pressured environment who don't feel appreciated or valued actually have double the chances of heart disease than those who do feel appreciated and valued and their work is worthwhile. And we also find that people who carry on working past the age of 65 actually live longer and have a better health environment than those who don't, because they still have a purpose in their life. Interesting enough, it doesn't just help us as individual workers. Those people who's reported being high on autonomy and belonging at work also found that their children 10 years later had better health outcomes and better educational attainment than those who scored low on belonging and autonomy at work. So there's a really strong pattern here. The broad message then is that these 5 drivers are really significant. They're also delightfully free. It doesn't cost you anything, let alone 50 million pounds. Though if you want to give me 50 billion pounds, I'm happy to spend it encouraging you to adopt these 5 drivers. But as you will all know, not all of this is a one size, unlike a woolly hat, this isn't one size fits all. The more we can target and focus this, the better. So at MindGym, we designed a diagnostic. The first thing we did was to understand the difference between well-being and ill-being. Just an absence of a negative doesn't mean you've got a positive. So just because I haven't got a broken leg doesn't mean I can run a marathon. And therefore we created two axes, very simple axes, one for well-being and one for ill-being. The ill-being being the x-axis, and the high ill-being is a bad thing and low ill-being is a good thing, and the y-axis, obviously, high well-being is a good thing and low well-being is a bad thing. And then we've built this diagnostic with our psychometricians and conducted some benchmark data. This is white-collar workers in the UK and US, so it's a very specific audience, and we could obviously go broader, and will do as we're running this diagnostic with clients at the moment. The first very interesting thing is that we have a group that's in crisis. This is about 4% of the population. By and large, if you're a business leader, you do not want to go anywhere near these people because you want to get the medical advice as quickly as possible. Any manager who thinks their mental first aid training is going to solve that problem is much mistaken, and that requires proper professional help. The second group, about 3 times the size, are slightly higher on well-being, but still quite high on ill-being. And they are the people who are struggling. We tend to notice those, we can see them. They may be late for meetings, seem exhausted. When you ask them how they are, they're some people like that in any case, so they're not necessarily struggling, but it could be an indicator. And so therefore what we find from them is that they're at risk clearly of going into crisis. The next group, not much lower on ill-being, but significantly higher on well-being, are the people called the fragile thrivers. These are the people we tend to think of as our best people. They're high performers, they're going places, they're high potential people, they're really committed to the work we're doing, they're terribly excited about it, but underneath they're paddling like crazy. And they're at risk of falling into struggling. They suddenly resign or they go off sick and you go, how did that happen? I didn't see that coming at all. That's because they're fragile thrivers. At the other end of the axis, you've got people who are lower on well-being, but also much lower on ill-being. They're fine. Not bothered at all. Everything's okay. In fact, you probably haven't even noticed them. And they're pretty happy about that as well. I remember talking to the guy talking about eustress and euphoric stress and de-stress, excessive stress. And he said, he was a 40-year-old engineer at BT, as it so happens. And I said, he said, honestly, I've never felt stress at work at all. So the only thing that bothers me is why my colleagues are doing much better than me at work. Well, that's probably because you're so low on stress that you haven't got the level to get you up there. So he's almost certainly boring out, and then we can help them as well. Then we've got a group that's coping and a group that's flourishing. Now the great news obviously is that the majority are in coping and flourishing, at least in our benchmark study, but when you run these sample sizes, in particular audiences and groups, you often get very different results, and even within organisations, the full-stack engineers in Indonesia could be boring out, whereas the marketeers in Amsterdam could be fragile thrivers. So it varies quite a lot. Very simply, what you've got is remedies. So the impact of these is quite interesting on various things like organisational commitment and intent to leave. You're boring out people. You're not going to get rid of them. They're planning to stay. Your fragile thrivers are more keen on your copers. But of course, if they fall into struggling, then that's going to change quite significantly. So this has some business correlates as well as obviously healthcare and outcome and correlates. And then the ways you solve these problems are relatively simple compared to all the great science that you have all been sharing and discovering, is that there are lots of things you can do to reduce ill-being. The two drivers that have most impact are certainty and competence. So you want to create a high learning culture, which massively increases self-efficacy. Indeed, the mere act of asking for advice does two things. It not only helps you learn, but the people you ask the advice from think you are cleverer than they did before. That was a very interesting factor there. So they ask advice actually, and when other people think you're cleverer, you're less likely to suffer from imposter syndrome, so your self-efficacy goes up. So there's lots of asking for advice that is a really good thing to do. The second area goes the other way. This is about increasing well-being. The two drivers here that matter most are purpose and belonging. So you've got these people who are boring out. The last thing you want to do is give them less work to do. They're going to bore out even more. It'll be an absolute disaster. What you want to do is to give them a sense of why did you join this company? Why does this work matter? You're with people who really care about you, who are committed to you. This is the way to go. And so therefore, the two drivers there. And then the last remedy, if you like, is about reinforcing. Stopping it getting worse, because this is a very fluid picture. Just because someone's a fragile thriver today doesn't mean they will be tomorrow. And what we're trying to do is to get people up to flourishing, but at the very least want to stop people going backwards. And therefore there's a whole reinforced strategy. For example, you spot your own psychological triggers and alarm calls where you see things going on and you notice something's not quite right, and then you can take preventative action before you end up in struggling or worst case in crisis and can't cope with that. So I guess to answer the question, sorry, there we are, and all of those drivers matter, but autonomy is particularly significant. So yes, work can be the cause of our poor health, but also I'd like to say it can be the cure. It needn't cost a penny. It can be done by all of us tomorrow, immediately. So whilst there are many things that we can't change and other things that are coming down the tracks fast to cause doom and gloom, this is one, a rare positivity, and I urge you all to go out and deliver these 5 drivers wherever you work. Thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely brilliant. And some of you may have been there on Monday and heard Octavius speak. I've heard a lot more new, interesting stuff as well. So it's never the same story. I didn't want you to be bored, Lynn.
I'm trying to keep you entertained.
No, it's fantastic. There is so much depth to this stuff. Purpose. I think we're all here with purpose. So, some questions? Yes.
Yeah, I did understand like how to work with 4 out of 5 as a team leader with 4 out of 5 things, but like how do I increase competence, or like how do I optimize competence of my team?
So how do you optimize the competence of your team as a team leader? Great question. One is clearly coaching, giving advice, helping people work out how to solve problems, and the right level of coaching, which will vary. So if someone's new to a job, they may need more coaching and more involvement, and as they become more experienced, you give them more space and you allow them to give them guidance. Second is giving them faith. I believe you can do this, and here are the 3 reasons why I believe you can do this. You faced problems like this before, and last time you did it, you thought it was impossible, but you still got through, or whatever else it is. It might be the reasons why I've given you this job. So giving them reasons to believe that they can do it, and coaching and support will all help increase self-efficacy.
So like, are they low on feeling competent when the problem is too hard, or they don't understand how to work with it?
So another way is to help break down the problem. Okay. So the problem is too hard, and you don't think they can do it either. You say, well, let's break this down into smaller chunks. I mean, one of the things that people are struggling, the first thing you do is reduce the amount of time and pressure on them and help them get to some mini milestones and make progress on something. So I can bank that success. Oh, that I have got done. Now let's go to the next one and the next one. There's a lovely technique for procrastination, which is called the 5-minute start. And you simply say, I'm going to give 5 minutes to this activity, and I can stop at the end of 5 minutes, but I'm going to give it 5 minutes. And once you've given it 5 minutes, you go, oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought, or you've made some way through, we've got sunk cost syndrome, and then you keep going.
Okay, that's quite cool. Question there, and then over to Joe. Yes, please.
Have you looked at any differences by age group? So you mentioned that people who work past retirement have a greater sense of purpose. And I'm thinking of things like companies using more digital tools that might affect feelings of confidence in older people. Have you looked at?
George, just correct, I may have misspoken. It's not that people who are older have more sense of purpose, it's but that people who carry on working continue their sense of purpose as much as they had before, just to clarify that. So having a sense of purpose gives you all sorts of health benefits and all sorts of persistency, energy benefits and so forth. What we haven't done is run that pattern, the picture of health by age. So we don't know yet. It's a fantastic question. We should go
But the competence issue, so not being digital natives as you get older could be an issue. Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly.
It absolutely could. And therefore the question is, what can you do on either to help older people feel confident, do things they feel confident about? So in the workplace, that's called job crafting, where you shape the job around the strengths of the person, and you help the individual who may be a great salesperson raise money for charity, rather than feel they have to design a website or whatever it is. Or you help them learn. Learning is one of the, I mean, it's just, there's a professor called Guy Claxon who talks about learnetics. And a learnetic is someone who knows what to do when they don't know what to do. And learning is like the greatest, in psychology, it's the nearest thing to erasing certainty for happiness. You know, just spend time with people who make you feel good, listen to music you like, learn. Pretty much the golden triangle of things that will make you happy.
Academia, by
definition. Exactly.
Okay, Joe, thank you.
So interesting, thank you very much. But certainty and autonomy, so the self-employed have a lot of autonomy. What about the certainty for them?
Yes, what they feel is they can... Sorry, the certainty is very interesting. So what happens with the self-employed quite often is something called confident uncertainty. So if you're in a very destabilised environment, you go experience chronic stress, and you never get your bearings, and you're probably better off getting out of it or finding something. Obviously, we have different appetites for certainty as individuals, so that first cycle of our pathologies, if you like, will determine that. But the second thing is that once you get a level of certainty, a level of security, so you just become self-employed for the first time, you haven't got any clients, you've got high levels of uncertainty, that's going to be quite demanding. But after a while, as if you're a freelance consultant, you find you're always worrying about not having enough work, and then suddenly the work comes in, and when you're too busy and you can't do all the work you like. So then what you create is tend to create a mindset of confident uncertainty, which is I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm confident whatever happens, I'll find a way to make it work. And I'll navigate around it. And therefore what we find is that the level of confident uncertainty increases in people who've been self-employed for periods of time.
Thank you. One last question from Paul, because we're keeping people from lunch.
Oh my God.
So, do the definitions for well-being and ill-being mean the same thing to everyone, or do different people perceive them differently?
It's a great question. The items that we've got on the indices that we've built is broadly, I'm going to paraphrase this terribly, my psychometricians luckily aren't in the room, so they can't tell me off, but broadly on the ill-being exercise, it's items that tend towards burnout. So what are the indicators that your high levels probably burn out versus low levels? And on the well-being axis is broadly in levels of measures that you turn towards engagement. So am I excited by what I'm doing? Do I feel positive about it? Do I feel committed? It's those are the items that we've got. And of course you can have the two at the same time. So you can feel stressed and exhausted and excited and committed. And that's what allows that. Right? That's how those axes work.
Brilliant. Right, well, I'd like to thank Octavius.